بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له. I am humbled and honored by all of the erudite people who are present, and I am humbled by your introduction. So Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyya is a phenomenon in Islamic history, not just a figure, as many of you, I'm sure, know. People since his time have, don't quite know, even those who disagree with him, how to quite disagree with him, because he was truly a remarkable, not just a scholar. He was a scholar, he was a mujahid, he was an activist. He was a philosopher, he was a theologian, he was a jurist, he was a linguist who had a language theory, which we are figuring out as we understand more of contemporary linguistic theory, that if you just look at nothing that he is famous for, just his language theory, he's one of the most remarkable theorists and philosophers in the entire history, not just Islamic history, that is. And I say that with greatest admiration for him. At the same time, he is used for such terrifying projects as we see in the Middle East today, such as whether it's ISIS or Al-Qaeda, and also before that, other movements. So the question I want to begin by addressing is, why is that the case? Why is he so invoked? Is he uniquely amenable to misinterpretation, or is there something substantive in his writings that leads to violence? And so I'm going to address that question more in a very brief way, just pointing to some of the things that we should look at. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what I do in my book, and finally end with more reflections on how scholars have appropriated him in the West, and how I think they have misappropriated. Now, of course, it's very common to say everybody has misappropriated someone we don't like. I'm not quite sure who has misappropriated or not, but I'm going to try to make a few arguments of what I think is happening. Ibn Taymiyya, for the last 2 centuries, since somebody like Al-Allama, the Iraqi Mufassir Al-Alusi, and Jamaluddin Al-Qasimi, the Syrian scholars in the 19th century, and then in the 20th century, people like Muhammad Abdu, Ahmed Muhammad Shakir, Hamid al-Fiqi, and then Rashid Rida, most of all, and after that, a number of other figures, and now contemporary giant Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, have all been fascinated by Ibn Taymiyya and have drawn on him with such enthusiasm, which is a remarkable contrast with the complete neglect of his works in the centuries before that. That is, in his lifetime, he is a phenomenon, but a phenomenon that almost becomes a pariah, so that people who draw on him, and people continue to draw on him, but people draw on him with great care and sometimes without giving due credit. So, for example, there's some recent research that shows that Imam al-Shatibi copies the whole passages from Ibn Taymiyya's writings in his al-Muwafaqat without giving credit, because Ibn Taymiyya has become so controversial by that time. Al-Shatibi writes a generation after Ibn Taymiyya. The same is true. There are some writings that shows, and this needs more investigation, that Ibn Khaldun also in some ways is influenced by Ibn Taymiyya, though this one is a claim I'm not quite sure about myself. This has been made in a dissertation. But then you find such diverse movements as some of the Indian scholars, people like Shah Waliullah, for example, were such great admirers of Ibn Taymiyya. And Shah Waliullah, if anybody knows, I mean, he's a giant. He's a Ghazali plus for his time. And Shah Waliullah has this capacity to admire both Ibn Taymiyya and Ibn al-Arabi at the same time. But you have then, in the last 2 centuries, the particular appropriations of Ibn Taymiyya, readings of Ibn Taymiyya have been such diverse as diverse and varied as you have people like the reformists, the modernists, and the militants, and the Wahhabis, all draw on Ibn Taymiyya. So what is the particular attraction of Ibn Taymiyya? And then, you have people like Fazl Rahman, who is very critical of the entire hadith literature, and certainly one of the most brilliant scholars, regardless of disagreement we may have with him. Fazl Rahman was no joke. And he is fascinated by Ibn Taymiyya. Some of his last writings, he quotes passages after passages from Ibn Taymiyya, as if, this was a great discovery for him. And, a colleague is working on a dissertation right now in the UK on that relationship between Fazl Rahman, his intellectual life, and especially fascination with Ibn Taymiyya. So, what is with him? That's one. I think that just to deepen some of the comments, Ibn Taymiyya's writings and his work was admired by his most trenchant opponents, even in his lifetime. So As-Subki, the father, for example, wrote, and he confided this to Imam al-Dhahabi, who is a great scholar in his own right, one of the greatest traditionalists of all times, who was not fully agreement with Ibn Taymiyya. So when he writes or quotes something about Ibn Taymiyya, he isn't simply doing that because he is trying to eulogize sort of Ibn Taymiyya. So he quotes from As-Subki that Ibn Taymiyya is an ocean of knowledge, and his piety, his love for God, is even more enormous than his knowledge. So this is someone who is very much in disagreement with Ibn Taymiyya on his theology and on his language theory. And then you have Dhahabi himself say similar things, which I'm not going to quote or go into detail, because my purpose really here is to draw out the main themes. We also know that Ibn Taymiyya is something different about Ibn Taymiyya. If you go look at the biographies, the tabaqat literature in history, you find that by the 4th century, most of the ulama had become professors like us. They are intellectuals. They are people who work for madrasas, or they work for, a madhab, a madrasa or an institution, you could say, that supports one madhab or another, but their, if you will, daily bread comes from some iqta', some income from some land which some military commander, some ruler, sultan or governor owns and gives them as pious waqf. But their job is to write books. With Ibn Taymiyya, you get something, almost a different phenomenon. You get someone who is an activist and a phenomenon, in the sense that, to give you a quick anecdote to give you a sense of that, Imam al-Ghazali, for example, who is a great hero and a great writer and a great phenomenon in Islamic history himself, but he's an intellectual. His life is the life of an intellectual, life of a professor. All right, with particular sensitivity to spiritual matters and to the niyyah. But, he's leading no armies. He's threatening no kings. In fact, it is the kings themselves who, in his early life, who sort of corrupt him, and he is disgusted by that and tries to run away from the Salajiqa and so on. That's not the case with Ibn Taymiyya. You get with Ibn Taymiyya someone who single-handedly prepares the Mamluk elite in Damascus to fight the Mongols in that very important, and he goes and he says to the rulers that if you do not fight, don't come back. We'll choose someone and we will fight. And so the Salar, who is the governor of Mamluk Damascus at the time, has to stay and fight. And at that time, he would go around, Ibn Taymiyya would go around and tell the people that you are going to be victorious. And he would say, people would say, at least say inshallah, Sheikh. He said, I say inshallah, but not because I'm not sure. It's God's will. And the victory did happen. This was a victory against the Mongols. It was no joke. And so his popularity in Damascus at the time was not so much one of a theorist or a theologian or a philosopher. He was seen as a saint. He was seen as a figure who was looked up by the masses as someone who had great, one could say, political clout, even though he had no political ambition. So at that time, the Mamluk king, Sultan in Cairo, calls him and says, people have been saying that you want my throne. And he says something that is so perfect, such a perfect reflection of both Ibn Taymiyya, and it's exactly what Jalaluddin Rumi said in a Persian couplet, or something similar. He says that that your throne, your kingdom, and the kingdom of the Mongols is not worth two fils to me. And the king says, yes, I know that. But he felt relieved that Ibn Taymiyya wasn't after his throne. But for the king to have suspected that Ibn Taymiyya was after a throne, a scholar, was something very remarkable in Islamic history, because scholars were intellectuals. Nobody should be threatened by me, at a political level. I couldn't convince a crowd to vote for me if my life depended on it. So this is the interesting sort of the phenomenon of Ibn Taymiyya. Yet Ibn Taymiyya, the centuries after, so he comes the 14th century, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, you don't really hear much of Ibn Taymiyya. He doesn't become a viable alternative. The late Sunni orthodoxy, Ash'ari or Maturidi in Kalam and in theology, in jurisprudence. In jurisprudence, Ibn Taymiyya actually doesn't really interfere much with the madhahib. Unlike the common sort of understanding, he doesn't have anything against taqlid. And then, but even in language theory, or you could say philosophy, you don't really see Ibn Taymiyya. But certainly, most importantly, in Kalam, Ibn Taymiyya is largely forgotten, except for by, he's taken seriously by some of the reformists and the jurists. So you find in Ottoman Empire there are some reforms connected to uqud, contract law based on the fatwa of Ibn Taymiyya. There are some scholars in India who are inspired by Ibn Taymiyya. Then in the 20th century, in the 19th and 20th century, things change. And what's really interesting, if you look at in Syria, in Iraq, some of the scholars who are working on Ibn Taymiyya are Sufis, followers of Ibn Arabi, who are fascinated by Ibn Taymiyya, and that is when Ibn Taymiyya is rediscovered. And then you have the other rediscovery of Ibn Taymiyya, which is by the Wahhabis. The Wahhabis themselves don't really use Ibn Taymiyya very much at first. In fact, Sulaiman ibn Abdul Wahhab, who is the brother of Sheikh Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, writes a refutation of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab using Ibn Taymiyya and Ibn al-Qayyim more than Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab himself uses Ibn Taymiyya. Right? And the Wahhabi answer at that time is that, well, yes, Ibn Taymiyya may have disagreed, but so what? We're not muqallids of Ibn Taymiyya. So the idea that Ibn Taymiyya provided, cannon fodder for, or fuel for the Wahhabi polemic is not entirely accurate. In fact, Ibn Taymiyya could be used against the takfir, the general takfir that the Wahhabis almost out of it was an innovation in Islamic history. After the first 3 centuries, you didn't really have general takfir of Muslims until the Wahhabis. And that also disappeared, by the way, in the century after. So Wahhabis sort of calmed down after that. But Ibn Taymiyya then reappears in a number of other projects. And the most important project intellectually is people like, to some degree the Syrian scholars, Alusi, Iraqi and Syrian scholars, but most importantly the Egyptians like Ahmed Muhammad Shakir and Hamid al-Fiqi and Rashid Rida. These are the giants, and each one of these scholars is a remarkable scholar. I mean, Ahmed Muhammad Shakir, if you read his, or Mahmoud Muhammad Shakir, I'm sorry. Ahmed also, Muhammad Shakir, but Mahmoud Muhammad Shakir, the brother who was the literator, especially edits a number of works and sort of makes the philosophical and the jurists and Ibn Taymiyya, the theologian Ibn Taymiyya available to the people. But that takes a long time for people to begin to read his works. Then, on the other hand, so let me switch gears and look at the Orientalist scholarship. Orientalists are at first are reading, thank you very much, Ibn Taymiyya in bits and pieces. And what they read, they're fascinated by, but they don't quite know what to make of him. And the general trend is that whatever an Orientalist is working on, and then he reads Ibn Taymiyya and says, well, Ibn Taymiyya is that. So, for example, Goldziher is working on Ibn Hazm. So he says Ibn Taymiyya is inspired by Ibn Hazm and he's a Zahiri. And that, whatever the Orientalists say, by the way, you will hear in a few years some Muslim scholars repeating it. Then you have other people who say Ibn Taymiyya was more of a Khariji, because somebody's working on Kharijis and he reads Ibn Taymiyya and says, hey, this guy is a Khariji. But then you have more recently Professor Yahya Misho, for example, who is a scholar of Ibn Sina, and he reads Ibn Sina, and he really is a great scholar of Ibn Taymiyya, unlike some of the other ones. And he says Ibn Taymiyya, is so heavily influenced by Ibn Sina. Also, I think if we were to look at Orientalists, one of the best scholars of Ibn Taymiyya in 1920s and 30s is André Louis, or Laoust, André Laoust, the French scholar, who is truly, he has limited number of works that are not edited, many of them, so he makes some central big mistakes about Ibn Taymiyya. Nonetheless, he is somebody who is a serious scholar, but even Western scholarship doesn't take Laos seriously, and then there is a big gap between 1930s and 1980s and 90s when you begin to get Western scholars interested in Ibn Taymiyya again. And nothing serious happens until more later in the 90s. Now, Laoust, to turn to Caliphate, for example, Laoust repeats something or says something that gets repeated by everyone, including Muslim scholars who are reading Western scholarship, which is that Ibn Taymiyya rejected the idea of the Caliphate. And Ibn Taymiyya says that the Sunni idea, the Sunni orthodoxy, the Caliphate is a dead horse and is not an obligation on Sunnis and so on and so forth. And that's a complete fiction. And you wonder, how can such a fiction, because in Majmu' Fatawa he has a very clear fatwa that not only that A, the Khilafah, Caliphate, is an obligation, B, even stronger, he says mulk, or kingdom, in Islam is haram. But it is tolerable under certain circumstances, right? So that but is tolerable is the part that everybody remembers. But the fact that he says mulk is haram and caliphate, therefore, is not a form of mulk, it's an obligation, is something that is forgotten until very recently, when people go back and look at what Ibn Taymiyya really was saying. Now, what is interesting is that you could understand why Laos said what he said, because if you read his Siyasa Shar'iyya, which is the main pamphlet that he writes for the rulers, it is a work that pays no attention to the Khilafah. Whereas if you read his Minhaj al-Sunnah and his Fatawa, there he says very clearly that Khilafah is an obligation, and So what I argue in my book, really briefly, is that Ibn Taymiyya changes the notion of what the Caliphate meant. For people like Mawardi Ghazali and Ibn Jama'a, even as a contemporary of Ibn Taymiyya, for the first few centuries, Khilafah was not a question, was not a debated question. This was the center of the backbone of Sunni Islam. But the way Khilafah was understood was that its basic merit was its continuity with the Prophet. Its continuity with the Prophet, that is the past, linking Muslim heritage, Muslims, Khalifa, the Banu Abbas, to the government established by the Prophet ﷺ. So even if this were the case, I would argue that if Ibn Taymiyya had written at that time, he would not have questioned the Khilafah. But after the Mongols, the Khilafah ends in all of its power, even its symbolic power ends. So that is what forces Ibn Taymiyya to rethink. The second thing is that the pre-Mongol classical Islamic thought thinks of the Khilafah as primarily a top-down or a descending institution, authorized by the Prophet in one hand, and on the other hand, a symbol of the unity of the Ummah. So that unity and that continuity, those two things are so central for the ulama that to question the Khilafah would have been nonsensical, would have been self-defeating for the Sunni ulama, especially in the face of the anti-caliphates or counter-caliphates that are the Fatimids in Egypt and so on. For Ibn Taymiyya, a new option opens up, but this option opens up for a lot of people, but other ulama do not take the cue. There are people who continue to consider the caliphate, the khalifa, as legitimate. And others who write about the great calamity of the Mongols in terms of the end times, in terms of the signs of the Day of Judgment literature, that the Mongols have spelled the end times, and there is no rational way to respond to what has happened. Ibn Taymiyya, and you'll find it's quite remarkable that his own student, a minor student, that is, was a younger student, Ibn Kathir, is a major figure in this literature who writes about signs of the Day of Judgment and so on. And many people are writing it at that time. This is a sign of, these are times of Black Death, these are times of the post-Mongol period. Everybody thinks end times are coming. Ibn Taymiyya's response is quite remarkable, that he has all the hadith in front of him, he doesn't write about end times literature. What he writes about is that how can the intellectual heritage of the Ummah can be, must be, should be reformed. This is a rational response. This is an activist response. And the way I like to put it, this is an optimistic response. This is a response that says, end times may be near, they may not be near, but that is not what we are asked to do. So you find in Ibn Taymiyya really no significant attention to the signs of the Day of Judgment literature, but rather what you have is he talks about, how the philosophers have corrupted this part of our heritage, the linguists have messed up this part of our heritage, that Ahlul Kalam have lost this part of our heritage, and we can fix this. By doing what? By doing rational reasoning, by arguing, by going back. So in short, Ibn Taymiyya's project was to use the first 3 centuries of Islam as a foil to critique the next 3 centuries of Islam. And he's writing in the 7th and 8th centuries. That, in short, is what he's trying to do. And that, in short, is one of the reasons why he is a very, very attractive figure for any movement that comes later and that wants to say that, hey, the great classical heritage is so great and so overburdening. We can never question it. And we are stuck to it. Ibn Taymiyya provides a way out. That is an equal weight to Ghazali and Razi. And that says, hey, there is a way, another way of doing kalam. And there's another way of reconciling reason and revelation. Now, this, to me, is the reason why he is such an attractive figure to not only the Wahhabis, but also to the reformists who are rational reformists of the 19th century Syria and Iraq and 20th century Egypt until today. Yet he also provides that possibility, because once you disrupt the continuity of the tradition, the opening that is possible, the way it's going to be now resettled, can be very ugly. In other words, he allows you to open ijtihad, but ijtihad is a double-edged sword. You could do ijtihad by saying, hey, we want to become more modern, but you could also do the same ijtihad and say, we want to, get rid of modernity altogether. We want to live in different times. So this is he provides that firepower to unsettle the weight of the classical heritage, which is found to be necessary by so many thinkers today. If you didn't have Ibn Taymiyya and the kind of aura that comes with Ibn Taymiyya, you would have to say that anytime I disagree with something that has been agreed upon by the Ash'ara or the Maturidiyya or the four madhahib in jurisprudence, I have, this is Islam and there is no way out. And I think in a way, Ibn Taymiyya provides, and we are all indebted to Ibn Taymiyya for his fiqh of uqud, for his questioning of the idea that triple divorce is effective. And so many of these things, whether he's right or wrong, he opens up the possibility. Yet at the same time, does Ibn Taymiyya blunder? Yeah, of course, I think he does. Which is precisely, to me, the great problem in the way contemporary Salafis read Ibn Taymiyya. They read Ibn Taymiyya as a singular figure, as the only person who got Islam right. Whereas I believe the way to read Ibn Taymiyya is in conversation with this great Islamic tradition, which he never denied, never rejected. In fact, he upheld the ulama and the respect for the ulama all his life, more so than, in fact, the ulama would conspire against him, that is to use sort of a very practical anecdote, to have him killed. When he comes out, a devoted follower of his becomes the king, and then he says, we're going to punish those ulama who had you imprisoned and trying to conspire to execute you. He turns against that king and he says, well, how dare you say that you can imprison the ulama? These are ulama. And this king, Qalawun, now turns again Ibn Taymiyya too, because he said, this dude is a loose cannon. You can't control him. But the point was that Ibn Taymiyya is very reverent of the ulama, yet he is pushing back against the authority of the ulama that seems, or that claims to be finalistic and so on. And that's something I argue in my book. My point is that if Ibn Taymiyya is read in isolation as the final version of Islam, then you have a problem. And as one of the intelligent commentators, Saudi dissident Muhammad al-Mas'ari, comments, and he has a nice work on this, where he says that his contemporary Saudis, they read only Ibn Taymiyya, but they don't read what Ibn Taymiyya is arguing against. Right? So in that sense, in a way, some of the other users of Ibn Taymiyya, like Yusuf al-Qaradawi and Ahmad al-Raisuni, are in my view more loyal followers of Ibn Taymiyya because they do what he recommends they should do. Right? So these people would say that Ibn Taymiyya is their role model. They're very clear about this. But when Ibn Taymiyya, for example, supports torture in his judiciary procedures and says that it's okay, Yusuf al-Qaradawi says, well, we'll take the opinion of al-Ghazali. And that, to me, is necessary, because Ibn Taymiyya never claimed to be infallible, and to do so is problematic. Similarly, Ibn Taymiyya's opinion on, for example, And I want to take on a different point here, that often the idea that Ibn Taymiyya is a literalist or a scripturalist. Actually, he is a scripturalist and literalist, but he also has a theology in which divine love of God, mercy of God, plays such a central role that he has difficulty understanding how would God put anyone in hellfire forever. So in one of his last fatwas, he, on prompting of his student, Ibn al-Qayyim, he says that, fana nar, he argues fana nar, or the eternity, the annihilation of the hellfire. This was, he and Ibn al-Qayyim argue, was one of the earlier opinions that hellfire comes to an end. Again, there is so much scriptural data that would say, just, how could you ever, reading this in the Quran, would ever say that hellfire would come to an end? But he argues, if you look at his argument is based that God, with all his mercy, would do that. So Ibn Taymiyya is not just a simple scripturalist. There are points at which he says, this couldn't be the case. Is there time?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. So that's just a sort of big picture. Now let me argue for what Ibn Taymiyya's political vision was and what it might mean today. I think if we want to understand Ibn Taymiyya quickly, in a nutshell, the crucial thing for him was the ability to love God actively, worship God and love God actively. So anything, any theology, any jurisprudence that in his view contradicted the possibility of loving God and God loving you back had to be fought. And as we see that even in the annihilation of the fire, this was, by the way, one of the last fatwas of Ibn Taymiyya, and it is controversial whether he wrote it or not. We know for sure that Ibn al-Qayyim held this opinion. Whether Ibn Taymiyya did or not is controversial. But nonetheless, if you look at all of his teachings about God, the love of God, his biggest problem with the Ash'ari theology was that Ash'aris made it impossible for God to be loved or love. That God could not love human beings, and human beings could not really love God. And that was his biggest problem with Ash'aris. That the Ash'aris, since Imam al-Baqillani, who had said that, love is a kind of weakness, God couldn't have it. So therefore, love has to be understood simply as a promise for reward in afterlife. Well, Ibn Taymiyya says, well, promise for reward is a different thing from love. And if you are not feeling love of God, in that sense, he was a very Sufi figure, and that's what people don't understand. Early Sufis were the enemies of Ahl al-Kalam for precisely these reasons. As you know, Hallaj was a Hanbali, and the only people who supported Hallaj when he was being executed were the Hanbalis. And this later, in the later medieval period, there was sort of a marriage between Sufism and Kalam or Ash'arism, by which, and as a result of which, people think that they have always been together. But in fact, early Kalam and early Tasawwuf were mortal enemies. And Ibn Taymiyya is in a way supporting the Sufis against Ahl al-Kalam by saying that no, God's love is real, and God's love on both directions is real. And if you tell me that your theology tells you God cannot love or God cannot act in time because God is eternal and timeless, then there is something wrong with it. So this ability, this necessity to act out of love for God, to worship God in an active way, is to me the central component. Now, what comes out of this is a word that I think we could use with some caution, but it describes his thought well, which is optimism. I don't mean modern optimism, I mean a religious optimism, meaning the hope that things can be done, hope that God, a theology of hope. And as we know, John Hoover, a colleague of ours who's a Catholic theologian and a very accomplished scholar of Ibn Taymiyya, writes this book called Ibn Taymiyya's Theology of Theological Optimism, which I think is an appropriate term, where he says that God's ability to act, God's necessity to act in time, is the crucial element of Ibn Taymiyyah, which he's trying to save from both Ash'ari theology and the philosophy at the time. What I argue in my book is that Ibn Taymiyyah also is a political, there is also his thought, political thought is also the thought of political optimism. The possibility that the Ummah, the Muslim community can act to change things. That was, it may sound like a given now that we live in a modern period, but it is quite a significant contribution if you want to be theologically serious about it. That we can be politically effective and we can change things, not wait for the Messiah or not wait for the Savior, but you can do things. And this comes out of what I argue is psychological optimism. The possibility that a human being is capable of knowing good from evil. The ethical objectivism, it's called in modern history, modern philosophical discourse. So, and this psychological optimism is fitra. His theology of fitra is quite remarkable because he says that ordinary human being, ordinary Muslim, can know right from wrong, can know ethical truths. Whereas the Ash'ara, as we know, famously held that they couldn't. And the Maturidiyya were in between. But Ibn Taymiyyah says that ethical truths are accessible to human beings. However, he's not a Mu'tazili in the sense that he doesn't bind God to reward in afterlife for the ethical knowledge that can come to us as a result of rational effort. No, he says, in other words, if you can know good, if you know good and evil, you're not going to be held accountable in afterlife until God sends a messenger and you become mukallaf in a different way. In that sense, he agrees with the Ash'ara. But on the other hand, in the human side, he agrees with the Mu'tazila, saying that human beings can know ethical truths. And this is, in my view, the foundation of a bottom-up political thought, in which an ordinary Muslim can know the right thing to do. So he has this famous fatwa where he says that ijtihad is a divisible thing, so that if you are an expert in one field, you can make ijtihad in that field. You don't have to be a mujtahid in everything. This, by the way, is also an opinion held by Imam al-Ghazali, but it doesn't become popular or operationalized by al-Ghazali, but it is there in al-Ghazali as well. But for Ibn Taymiyyah, if you look at especially his popular works like Siyasa al-Shar'iyya and al-Hisba and so on, this is very central, that nasiha becomes central to the social vision. Finally, his political vision and his views on his caliphate in the last 5 minutes. How is he different in his theory of khilafah? I argue that there is no doubt Ibn Taymiyyah says khilafah is an obligation for Muslims. That's sort of a foundation of Islamic Sunni theology. Nobody has ever really disagreed in the pre-modern period. What he says, however, is that khilafah is not a ritual obligation, but a rational obligation. And that is where he disagrees with the Ash'ari theory. What he says, by the way, when I'm saying Ash'ari theory, it was really the predominant theory of khilafah since Mawardi Baqillani, before him al-Baqillani, until al-Ghazali and Ibn Jama'ah. The reason I'm calling it Ash'ari theory is because the majority of the best people who wrote the theory were all Ash'ari. Ibn Hanbalis and others, Maturidis, accepted that theory, but the people who really contributed to it were all Ash'ari. Now, in that theory of the Caliphate, Khilafah, to establish a Khalifa was an obligation for the Ummah, regardless of whether the Khalifa had actual political power or not. As Imam al-Ghazali, who is the most, if you will, the strongest advocate of the Sunni Khalifa, he says that without a Khalifa, all of Islamic life and all of the Muslims' contracts, including their marriages, become invalid without a Khalifa. This statement he makes twice, both once in Ihya Ulumuddin and once in Al-Mustasfa. Not Al-Mustasfa. Iqtisad fil i'tiqad. So this is the Ash'ari theory, which is that Khilafah is a ritual obligation. Khalifa has to be there for Sunni Islamic life to be valid. Ibn Taymiyya says, no, it's not a ritual obligation. In other words, think of it as wudu. How to Ibn Rushd distinguishes between ritual obligation and rational obligation is in Bidayat al-Mujtahid. You could look up there. But basically the idea, if you look at wudu, it's a ritual obligation. If you have an element of wudu missing, it's invalid. All of it is invalid. You can't say, ما لا يدرك كله لا يترك لا يترك كله لا يترك جله. ما لا يدرك كله لا يترك جله. You can't say that about rituals. Your salah is already either valid or invalid. Your wudu is either valid or invalid. As opposed to in a ritual, rational obligation such as putting the food on your family's table so they will live on. It's your responsibility as a man's responsibility to provide for them. If you don't have a job, you cannot go pretend that you have a job. And if you don't have a full-time job, you can get a part-time job. But what is intended by this obligation is a very rational end. So Ibn Taymiyya basically says that Khilafah is not the first kind of obligation, it's the second kind of obligation. It's an obligation that is there to protect the application of God's law and justice. If there isn't justice and if there isn't God's law being upheld, then the Khilafah is worthless. And that is where, now, what is required to make this argument? It's quite a bit, because the theory that underpinned the Khilafah theory was quite profound, quite serious, and is grounded in theology. In other words, to be a Sunni and then reject the Khilafah theory was not easy. So that's why it will take you 300 pages to get my humble point, which may be wrong, but nonetheless, I needed that space to make it. And I can't make it in 2 minutes, but to end this discussion, what I think Ibn Taymiyya made possible was a bottom-up theory of Islamic political action and bottom-up theory of Islamic political system. Meaning that he says, if you look at his siyasa shar'iyya, and he does not argue about the theory of why an Islamic government is necessary based on the past actions of Muslims, but based on the Quran and Hadith. And you would say, well, that's completely uninteresting. Wasn't everybody doing that? And the answer is nobody was doing that. You read Al-Ghazali, you read Al-Mawardi. No one says Islamic government or government is necessary based on the Quran and Sunnah. They're saying that it is necessary because the Sahaba did that, because it is an ijma' of the Sahaba. It's history and continuity with that history. And perhaps if Ibn Taymiyya lived in that time, he would have done the same. But because of the Mongol destruction of the Caliphate, he recreates if you will, the theory of Islamic political system bottom up by saying that, look, Islamic government is nothing but al-amru bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar. And as such, it is you can draw its obligation from the Quran, or look at the Sunnah and you get the idea that if you had 3 people traveling, one of them should be the Amir. He says, well, that means if that's all Ummah must have an Amir. So he goes to the original sources and almost is unique in doing that because, in my view, is a conjuncture of both his own personal ijtihad and his courage, but also the times in which he lived. And that's why there is no book titled Siyasa al-Shar'iyya before Ibn Taymiyya ever in the first 7 centuries, whereas after Ibn Taymiyya there are many such books. And today this is the most common name you'll hear, Siyasa al-Shar'iyya. But there is not a single book that's written in the first 7 centuries with that title. So, whatever I've said, if there is any good influence from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I'm sure there are many things that I have either misstated or misunderstood, and that's from me. And I invite you to comment and ask questions. Thank you very much for being a wonderful audience.
Thank you.